Okay, today we're going to be looking at the heart, chapter 17. As you can see from this frontal view, you can see what you see mostly is the right atria and right ventricle. And there's a little groove right where the yellow highlight is, okay? And that is where the interventricular sulcus is located. And that's primarily going to separate your right ventricle from your left ventricle. The apex of the heart is where the heart comes to a point at the inferior border of the heart, okay? And I'll outline that area in white here. Okay, that's this area right here is called the apex, okay? And these other vessels that you see leading to the heart and out of the heart are the pulmonary trunk. That's the first major vessel that you see on the anterior side coming out of the right ventricle. And I'll label that with a dark highlight. That is the right ventricle, this little, and it's leading to the outflow tract of the pulmonary trunk. So when blood leaves the right ventricle, it'll leave the pulmonary trunk and then into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Notice I said arteries instead of veins. Okay, this is the only time that you'll see an artery that's carrying deoxygenated blood, okay, leading away from the right ventricle. Well, that's not, there is an exception to that. The umbilical veins carry oxygenated blood, okay, and the umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood. As a rule, though, most of your systemic arteries carry oxygenated blood, but this is the exception. Your pulmonary trunk, which becomes the right and left pulmonary arteries, actually carry deoxygenated blood. Okay. Then you have four pulmonary veins, which you can see the tips of, leading into the left atrium. Okay. You can see them. You can see the pulmonary veins just below the pulmonary trunk. Okay. There's these little appendages that look like little ears called auricles, and you can see these auricles on top of the right ventricle, and then you also have an auricle on the top of the left ventricle. So let's go through some of the anatomy where the heart's located in the thoracic cavity. The heart is located right in the middle of the thoracic cavity, slightly situated toward the left side of the thoracic cavity. Remember, the middle part of the thoracic cavity is what we refer to as the mediastinum. The mediastinum houses most of your cardiovascular structures. Okay, I had to turn my mic on just to make sure it was working okay. Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, all right. It seems like it's working all right. Okay, so looking at the second slide that's in your field of view, you can see the mediastinum, which is where the heart's located in the thoracic cavity. Notice the heart rests upon the diaphragm, this huge muscular organ that separates your abdominal cavity from your thoracic cavity. This is called the diaphragm. 70% of your respiratory movement is provided by this flat muscle, the diaphragm. Okay, and as you can see, the veins are. Some of the veins are colored blue, but blue denotes deoxygenated blood. The color red denotes oxygenated blood. And most anatomy and physiology textbooks use that type of coding. Okay, so you can see that the heart rests on the diaphragm. It's right between the two lungs. Remember, your right lung has 3 lobes to it, separated by fissures. The left lung has 2 lobes, also separated by grooves and fissures. Okay, but notice the left heart you only can see just a part of that left ventricle because most of the left ventricle is posteriorly located. Okay, so it's fairly flat, whereas the right ventricle and right atrium, they're more rounded in their view. Okay, you can see the superior vena cava taking deoxygenated blood from the body. And then you can see the inferior vena cava. You can see that very tip of that blue vessel. That's the inferior vena cava taking deoxygenated blood from the lower body into the right atrium. Okay, there's going to be 3 vessels that take blood to your right atrium. Remember, your atrium are your receiving chambers. Okay, they're receiving blood from the body. Okay, and the coronary arteries. So there's three vessels that take blood into the right atrium, and those are the superior vena cava, which takes blood from the upper body, the inferior vena cava, which takes blood from the lower body, including the abdominal cavity and the lower extremities. And then the third vessel that takes blood into the right atrium is the coronary sinus, which takes blood from the heart. Okay? So they've retracted the lung so that you can see the right ventricle and that groove between the right ventricle and the left ventricle called the interventricular sulcus, the anterior ventricular sulcus. And in that sulcus will lie your blood vessels, a couple of your blood vessels. One is called the left anterior descending coronary artery, which supplies blood to most of the left ventricle and even part of the right ventricle. And then the other vessel that lies in that groove is the great cardiac vein, which is returning blood from the heart to the coronary sinus. Okay. And then you have a right and left atrioventricular sulci, which are the grooves that separate the atria from the ventricles. Okay. Now in figure B, you're going to see a transverse view of the heart within the mediastinum, and you can see the right lung and left lung as they are positioned in the thoracic cavity. Okay, and you can see the openings of the chambers. This would be comparable to what one would see in a CT scan when they saw a cross-sectional view. This is a transverse section. Okay, you can see the vertebral bones that form the posterior border of the heart. Okay, so of course the body wall, the ribs, and part of the thoracic cage, those all surround the lungs and give some protection also to the heart. Okay, you can see that very large aorta, which is taking oxygenated blood from the left ventricle. Of course, the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that takes, of course, ingested food into the stomach, the first part of the digestive system. Okay, now you've got membranes that cover the surface of the heart. Those are called the pericardial membranes. And there's a cavity between two of those membranes called the pericardial cavity filled with serous fluid. And we'll talk about that later when we look at the pericardial membranes. Okay. Okay, so you can see the right ventricle, which is when you're facing the image, it's on your left side. So there's the right ventricle, and then the left ventricle is on the other side. You can see even part of the valves within these interiors of these chambers. Okay, and then the picture in figure C, you can see a left lateral view, and this is how you can best see the anterior and posterior structures. You can see how that ascending artery makes a curve to become the arch of the aorta, and then makes another curve where it descends and becomes a descending aorta. Okay, and it's where that aorta curves, that arch of the aorta, is where you get your three main vessels coming out of the aorta. Okay. Okay, and of course it's in the mediastinum. The sternum, of course, is the anterior border. The apex is the area where the heart comes to a point on the inferior left border. And of course the diaphragm is what the heart is resting on, primarily that left ventricle. You can see how posterior, how flat that left ventricle appears. And then the base of the heart continues posteriorly. Okay, so that's a transverse view and a lateral view. And you can look at these x-rays also, and you can visualize structures more completely when you get these different views of the heart within the mediastinum, frontal view, transverse view, or a left lateral view. And that's basically what happens when somebody comes in and gets a chest x-ray and they're trying to ascertain, the condition of the heart. Okay, so this is the location of the heart in the chest, in the mediastinum, and this shows you the lung lobes retracted a little bit so you can see the left ventricle and the right ventricle. There's the anterior ventricular sulcus with the left anterior descending artery, which of course is colored red because it's carrying oxygenated blood to most of the left ventricle and part of the right ventricle. By the way, just as a side note, the LAD, or the left anterior descending artery, also called the anterior interventricular artery, This is probably the most important coronary artery in the heart, and primarily because it provides a great deal of oxygenated blood flow to both ventricles, the left ventricle primarily, but also partly to the right ventricle. So when this blood vessel is occluded or blocked in any way, almost nobody survives a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, when it's a result of the occlusion of this vessel, of this great vessel. And then you can see the right auricle, which looks like an ear, which is attached to the right atrium. Okay, and what these auricles do, look like little ears. That's how they get the name auricles. Right where you see the yellow highlight, okay, that's your right auricle, and then your left auricle denote with the blue color. Okay, and it's basically attached to the left and right ventricles. The bright blue is your left auricle attached to the left atrium. Okay. Of course, the ribs are what afford protection along with the intercostal muscles, and then you've got your pleural cavities, which they don't show you in this image. But this is a real good image where you can see the mediastinum, the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, and then the grooves, the interventricular sulci, and the atrioventricular sulci between the atria and the ventricles. And this is a close-up detailing that transverse view that we saw in the picture a while ago. You can see all of this area where the heart's located is the mediastinum that you see in brackets. So the anterior border is the sternum, the posterior border is the vertebral column, and then it's surrounded by your right and left lungs with their lobes. Okay. Notice the esophagus is located posterior, adjacent to the aorta. And this is just that left lateral view. I want to just call to your attention, though, there's a little ligament that you see between the pulmonary trunk and the arch of the aorta. And this little ligament, I'll basically color blue. I'll highlight this area in blue right here. Okay, that is called the ligamentum arteriosum. And it is actually a remnant of the ductus arteriosus in the fetal heart structures. Okay, because at birth, the ductus arteriosus, which was a connection in the fetal heart that connected the pulmonary trunk with the aorta to provide oxygenated blood to the baby, to the infant's lung, or to the fetus's lungs, that has to close at birth, and it becomes this ligament, and that basically is a remnant of that ductus arteriosus that was patent, was open during the development of the fetal circulation. Okay, so here's your interior view of the heart, detailing the chambers of the heart. You can see the right atrium and left and right ventricle are carrying deoxygenated blood, which is denoted by the blue color. And then the deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle then leads to the pulmonary trunk. Then out the pulmonary trunk, it then is led to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. Your right pulmonary artery will take deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The left pulmonary artery will take deoxygenated blood to the left lung. Okay, and once the deoxygenated blood is delivered to the lungs, to the alveoli in the lungs, little air sacs, the blood is oxygenated and then it's returned back to the heart via the four pulmonary veins, which now are colored red because they're carrying oxygenated blood. So the four pulmonary veins will lead into the left atrium, which is carrying basically oxygenated blood now, and then it'll go through a valve called the mitral valve into the left ventricle. Okay, and then from the left ventricle, the oxygenated blood then goes out the aortic valve and into the aorta to the body. Okay. All right, so you can look at this image, this slide 7, and they show you two different circulations here. One is called the pulmonary circuit, which is on top, and the other, figure B, is called the systemic circuit on the bottom. Okay, and you can see the blue and the red are denoting, like I said before, deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. So the pulmonary circuit includes those structures of the heart, those chambers that pump the blood to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then return that oxygenated blood back to the heart via the four pulmonary veins. So looking at this figure A, you can see this deoxygenated blood that's coming from the systemic circulation is returning to the heart via the inferior and superior vena cava. And then deoxygenated blood then goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, then is pumped out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk, and that's the pulmonary valve, into the right and left pulmonary arteries, where that blood is going to be oxygenated in the alveoli. Okay, and then once that blood is oxygenated, then it returns to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins, which are colored red to denote oxygenated blood. And now that oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. So your right heart, which are your right atrium, right ventricle, your pulmonary trunk, plus the blood capillaries and blood vessels taking blood to the lungs and turning blood from the lungs to the heart, that's all what we refer to as the pulmonary circuit. Okay. So your deoxygenated blood is pumped to the lungs by the right side of the heart, where you get gas exchange occurring between the alveoli and the blood in the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries. And then the oxygenated blood now is going to be pumped to the body by the left side of the heart, which is going to be colored red because it's carrying oxygenated blood. So this is the pulmonary circuit. Okay. And then the picture on the bottom is your systemic circuit. Okay. And this shows you your systemic circuit basically includes the oxygenated blood now being pumped to the body by the left side of the heart. The left ventricle is the primary chamber. And now you've got gas exchange occurring in your systemic circulation, occurring between the blood and the systemic capillaries that you see in figure B. This area that I'll basically highlight in yellow. Okay. And then now, once that oxygenated blood is delivered to the tissues via those systemic capillaries, now the deoxygenated blood will then return back to the heart, okay, into the right atrium through the inferior vena cava, taking deoxygenated blood from the lower body below the diaphragm, and deoxygenated blood returning from the upper body via the superior vena cava. Okay, so this just basically outlines the flow of blood through both the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. First, your deoxygenated blood is pumped to the lungs by the right side of the heart. Then you have your gas exchange occurring between the air and the alveoli and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. And then finally, the oxygenated blood is returned to the left side of the heart via the 4 pulmonary veins. And then the systemic circuit is illustrated where the oxygenated blood now is pumped to the body by the left side of the heart. Okay, and gas exchange now will occur in the systemic capillaries between the tissues and the blood in the systemic capillaries. And then after that oxygenated blood is delivered to the body tissues, now the capillaries are deoxygenated, colored blue now, so it's going to be returned back to the heart via the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Notice the systemic capillaries are denoted with a purple color, and that's because they're in transition. The hemoglobin is delivering the oxygen to the tissues, so the blood becomes partially deoxygenated until it's fully deoxygenated after it loses the oxygen molecules. That's the reason you get that mix of red and blue, the violet or the purple color. So now let's look at the membranes that encompass the heart, the pericardial membranes. The heart is a pumping structure. Okay, it's a cardiac muscle, but it consists of chambers, cavities with valves. Okay, and it has a function to circulate the blood and basically oxygenate the blood and send it to the rest of the body. So because the heart is pumping and it's continuous, it ends up generating a lot of heat through the constant, continuous pumping action of the heart. So it lies in these membranes called the pericardial membranes. So the outer wall of the heart, it is called the fibrous pericardium. That's what you see in figure A And it's that tough connective tissue layer that anchors the heart to the surrounding structures like the diaphragm and the and most of this is just dense, irregular connective tissue. That's referred to as the fibrous pericardium. In Figure B, you can see a detail of the fibrous pericardium covering the other two membranes, the visceral and parietal pericardial membranes. Your pericardial membranes are actually very thin, simple squamous epithelium, and they secrete a fluid called serous fluid, and that fluid lubricates the cavity between those two membranes called the pericardial cavity. Okay, and what that does, that reduces friction and that's reduced. It reduces the heat that's generated by the friction that's created by this pumping action of the heart. So if you look at the layers of the heart wall, you actually have three layers. The inner lining of the layer is called the endocardium, okay? And it basically lines the open cavities, okay? And then the middle layer of the heart is referred to as the myocardium. That's where the heart muscle is located, the cardiac muscle that contracts and produces the pumping action, okay? And then the outer layer of the heart wall is actually called the epicardium, or the visceral pericardium. That's what you see in Figure C in that outer layer. Okay, the epicardium is actually the visceral pericardium, which is your inner serous membrane layer. Okay, and then the parietal pericardium is the layer of the serous membrane that basically covers the visceral pericardium. But just remember, the visceral pericardium is the same structure as the epicardium, which ends up becoming the outer layer of the heart wall. So, just remember, though, I'd like to kind of go back just for a minute. Just remember your gas exchange is going to occur in your lungs, and that's where you find your pulmonary capillaries and your alveoli. And that's where you're going to find the gas exchange between the air of the alveoli and the blood of the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So here's another image showing you the heart inside the pericardium. And these are the layers again, with the visceral pericardium being the epicardium, the pericardial cavity being the potential space between the two membranes, and then the parietal pericardium, that little thin blue line, is the serous membrane that and it covers the visceral pericardium. So what happens is these are both simple squamous epithelium, and when the heart is forming, this layer basically turns in on itself, okay, and then becomes the epicardium or the visceral pericardium. And of course, the outer connective tissue, the thickest layer is going to be the fibrous pericardium, and you can see it anchors the membranes to the other structures like the great vessels and the diaphragm. And this is a good detail showing you that the three layers of the heart wall, the endocardium, myocardium, and the epicardium. And then here's your pericardial cavity in between the visceral and parietal pericardium, and the fibrous pericardium being the outer layer. So this shows you the pericardial membranes as they form. This is the serous fluid that develops within inside the serous pericardium. And it's kind of like, sometimes it's very similar to, let's say, if you put your hand and made a fist and then put your hand inside a balloon, okay? And your hand would become, the outer surface of your hand would become the visceral pericardium, and the balloon would become the parietal pericardium, okay? And that's kind of what you see here with the development of those two serous membranes. So this is the anterior view of the external heart, okay? Just a second. Okay, I want to go into some information here that before I go on. A couple things I want to review. Why is the left side of the heart called the systemic pump? And it's because it receives oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins and then pumps that blood to the blood vessels that serve the rest of the body. Okay, and that's what we refer to as the systemic circuit. So in the systemic capillaries, the oxygen then will diffuse from the blood into the tissues, and then at the same time, the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues back into the blood. Okay, so as a result of this gas exchange in the tissues, the veins, the systemic capillaries will deliver deoxygenated blood back to the right side of the heart, where it has to be reoxygenated back by the lungs again. Some of the other functions of the heart is that it helps maintain homeostasis of the pressure of the blood. It also the pressure that the blood exerts on blood vessels is what we call blood pressure. And the rate and force of the heart's contractions is a huge factor that determines and influences blood pressure and the blood flow to the various organs in the human body. There is a hormone produced by the atria of the heart called atrial natriuretic peptide. This hormone works to lower your blood pressure when it becomes elevated by causing excretion of sodium in water. ANP, which stands for atrial natriuretic peptide hormone, decreases your sodium ion retention in the kidneys. It causes excretion of sodium in water, and that reduces the osmotic water reabsorption and therefore the volume and pressure of the blood in the blood vessels. And that's how ANP hormone lowers your blood pressure. Notice this view of the heart in this slide number 15. You can see the anterior interventricular artery in the interventricular sulcus, the great cardiac vein, which is lying in the interventricular sulcus. You can see the pulmonary trunk, the ligament arteriosus between the pulmonary trunk where it's dividing and the arch of the aorta, where we see the highlighted yellow. The right and left pulmonary veins, which carry oxygenated blood from the lungs. There's the right auricle and left auricle, the right pulmonary artery, and the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay. And this is a cadaver photo of a heart showing you the major great vessels as well as the coronary arteries. Okay. The left ventricle, the right ventricle. You can see the anterior interventricular artery, this area right here in yellow. Okay, that's the anterior interventricular artery, also called the LAD, or the left anterior descending artery. This is probably the most important coronary artery in the heart, because when it becomes blocked or occluded from coronary artery disease, it reduces oxygenated blood flow to the left ventricle and part of the right ventricle, which are your major pumping chambers of the heart. You can see the right coronary artery coursing between the atrioventricular sulcus, okay, between the right auricle and the right ventricle. And there's the pulmonary trunk, the ascending aorta. In orange here is the ascending aorta. Okay, then where it curves, it becomes the arch of the aorta. Okay, here in red. And then when it goes on the other side, when the arch of the aorta then curves downwardly and descends posteriorly, it becomes the descending aorta. But at the very beginning, it's the ascending aorta. Okay. The circumflex artery is a coronary artery that encircles around the left atria and left ventricle, courses in between the left atria and the left ventricle, and goes back around behind the heart. Okay, it comes off the left coronary artery that lies in the groove of the atrioventricular sulcus. This is a posterior view of the heart. You can see the four pulmonary veins carrying oxygenated blood being returned from the lungs to the left atrium. You can see the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta. You can see the great vessels coming off the arch. By the way, the first vessel that you see here, which we'll learn later, is the brachiocephalic trunk. The brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, that's your first vessel that you see. Brachiocephalic trunk. Put a B for brachiocephalic. The second vessel that you see is called the left common carotid artery, and it'll basically course on the left side of the neck and travel with the left internal jugular vein. And then the third vessel is your left subclavian artery, which takes oxygenated blood to the left shoulder and arm area. That's the left subclavian artery. And it basically takes blood to the left arm, okay, and left shoulder. The left arm. See if I can spell. Okay. All right. Then, of course, the pulmonary veins and 4 pulmonary veins, which are on the posterior side of the left atrium. The circumflex artery traveling in the coronary sinus, and you can see the posterior ventricular artery traveling with the middle cardiac vein on the posterior side of the heart. But you can see how flat that left ventricle is. And then the interior of the heart, after it's dissected, you're looking at it from the anterior view, you can see the pulmonary valves. Those are called semilunar valves. You have one in the aortic valve and another one in the pulmonary valve. They're called semilunar valves because when you look at those valve cups, they look like little half moons. And a half moon is how they derive the term semilunar. So the semilunar valves are the valves that separate the blood from the ventricles and the vessels, like either from the right ventricle in the pulmonary trunk or the left ventricle in the aorta. Whereas the AV valves, or aventricular valves, are the valves between the chambers, the left atria and left ventricle, and the right atria and right ventricle. You have 3 cuffs in your right AV valve, and you have only 2 cuffs in your left AV valve. And that's what we call the left AV valve, the mitral valve, or the bicuspid valve, because it has 2 cuffs. Cuspid, that's the shape of the valve leaflet. And then on the right AV valve, you've got 3 cuffs. Okay, and the valves are attached to these little cords called chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae, like little purse strings, those are attached to these little muscles called papillary muscles. And what they do is they keep those valves taut between contractions so blood does not prolapse back up into the upper chambers. There is another depression in the atria, the right atrium, called the fossa ovalis. That depression is a remnant of the connection between the right atria and the left atria in the fetal heart circulation. In the fetal heart circulation, the blood in the right atria and the blood in the left atria mix together because of that foramen ovale. Because remember, the heart, you don't have 2 separate pumps in the fetal heart. And that's because the oxygenated blood is being delivered from the mother's placenta, the chorionic villi in the placenta, which is where the blood is exchanged between the mother and the then growing and developing fetus. So that fossa ovalis is the remnant of that foramen ovale after that foramen ovale closes at birth. You can see the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid or mitral valve, because it looks like a mitre hat, a bishop's hat. Superior vena cava, taking blood from the upper body. Inferior vena cava, taking blood from the lower body. Papillary muscles, which keep these chordae tendineae real tight when the valves contract between blood flow. You can see the openings of the left pulmonary veins within the chambers of the left atrium. Basically that's it. Here's your pulmonary veins and pulmonary arteries also that you can see. Anyway, that's an anterior dissection part. Okay, and this is a cadaver photo that shows you the papillary muscles. Okay, I'll put those in yellow. Here's your papillary muscles in your cadaver heart. Here and here, here. The chordae tendineae, make those orange. These are the little purse strings, those are the chordae tendineae. Okay, and then you have the pulmonary valve, the ascending aorta. Okay, then you have the arch of the aorta, and then your major vessels that come off the arch of the aorta. The brachiocephalic trunk is your first branch. That's number 1. The second branch is your left common carotid artery, number 2. And then the third branch is the left subclavian artery. That's number 3. Okay. And there is a transverse view after the heart has been bisected. And so you can see this transverse view showing you the interior of the chambers of the ventricles. So as you can see, the right ventricle is crescent-shaped, half-moon-shaped. The left ventricle is more elliptical, more round. Notice the walls between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. See how thick that left ventricle is? And that's because the left ventricle has to pump blood against a much stronger pressure of the systemic circulation, where the right ventricle, it only has to pump blood to the lungs to be oxygenated, where it just travels a short distance. So therefore the vessel wall, remember this is muscle, so muscle always contracts and responds to whatever load is forced on it. So since there's a little pressure in the pulmonary circuit, only 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury, the vessels, the walls do not become extremely thick in the right ventricle compared to, let's say, the left ventricle, where they have to pump blood to the whole body into the systemic circulation. You can see the interventricular septum plus the wall of that entire left ventricle is extremely thick, almost 3 times the thickness as the right ventricle. Of course, the interventricular septum is also serves a purpose of contraction and helping pump blood through the chambers and into the vessels. And this is a view showing you the valves. You have 4 valves, 2 AV valves, a tricuspid and a bicuspid valve, and 2 semilunar valves. Notice the aortic valve is located superior to the pulmonary valve. Okay, and of course the fibrous skeleton of the heart is juxtaposition between the AV valves on top and the semilunar valves on bottom. Okay, and the picture on the bottom shows you a closed pulmonary valve on the left and an open pulmonary valve on the right. And this is the AV and semilunar valves after they close. And this is a pulmonary valve closed on the left and then open on the right. And when these valves close, this is what produces your heart sounds. Your first heart sound is produced by the closing of the AV valves, the closure of the semilunar valves, like the ones that you see here. These produce your second heart sound. So when you listen to the heartbeat, it sounds like a lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. And the lub sound is the closure of your AV valves. And your dub sound, your shorter, less pronounced sound, that's closing of the semilunar valve, like this pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve and the aortic valve should close simultaneously, but with ventilation, the pulmonary valve will slightly be delayed because of the pressure built in the respiratory chamber. So this is an outline showing you the blood flow through the entire heart and into both the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. This is a cardiac catheterization that's been done to show what's happening with the coronary arteries. This person probably had a myocardial infarction, and he's got an obstruction of the left coronary artery, as you can see, as it branches into the circumflex. Okay, and that's how they generally diagnose, a blockage, with the cardiac catheterization. Here's the anterior ventricular artery, okay, or the LAD, left anterior descending, coursing in front of the left ventricle and right ventricle. And then here's the circumflex artery on the posterior side of the heart. There's the left coronary artery up here. That's basically what occurs when you basically inject a dye into the coronary arteries, and then they light up on X-ray through this cardiac catheterization. So this is the distribution of the coronary arteries on top in figure A and the coronary veins on the bottom. Okay, as you can see, the anterior ventricular arteries, they course on top of the left ventricle, and then the right coronary artery courses between the right auricle and the right ventricle, and then the left coronary artery will bifurcate, will split into the LAD artery and the left coronary artery, which then courses through that atrioventricular sulcus and goes behind the heart. So all this pink area is the area supplied by the circumflex artery on the posterior side of the left atrium. Of course, these are your pulmonary veins. And then the picture on the bottom, the yellow area is the area supplied by the anterior ventricular artery. Okay, and in the posterior view, you can see the posterior ventricular artery in orange here, and then the right coronary artery supplies most of this area of the right auricle. Okay, And then the picture on the bottom shows you the distribution of the coronary veins. Remember, coronary veins are taking blood from the heart and delivering it back to the right atrium via the coronary sinus. So here's the right ventricle, of course, is on the right side, but on the other side of the left ventricle. And the left ventricle was on the left side of the heart, of course. And then you've got the great cardiac vein running alongside the anterior ventricular artery. And then it's basically draining blood from most of the left ventricle. And then the area drained by the great cardiac vein, you can see, is all this in dark blue on either side. The middle cardiac vein on the posterior side of the heart is this area in the kind of the royal blue, okay? And then the middle cardiac vein is all this bright blue. And then the purple area is on the posterior side, okay, which is part of the right ventricle and right atrium, okay. So here's your coronary artery distribution, showing you the anterior right coronary artery, anterior ventricular artery, also called the LAD for left anterior descending artery. Remember, this is the one that's also called the widowmaker, because when it becomes occluded, almost nobody survives, okay, when that coronary artery is obstructed from coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease is a disease of the coronary arteries whereby the arteries develop a condition called atherosclerosis. And you get these fatty plaques, which are deposits of cholesterol, okay? And basically it comes, from the foods that we eat, our diet. And eventually they can completely occlude a coronary artery, which supplies oxygenated blood to the myocardium. So when those become occluded, the cardiac muscle will eventually infarct or die, and it won't get adequate oxygen, which is essential for the function of the cardiac muscle. Okay, and that's the reason the LAD, sometimes it's called the widow maker, okay? Because almost nobody survives from it. It normally occurs in males compared to females. So here's your right coronary artery between the right auricle and the right ventricle. Then you've got your air supplied by the circumflex artery, being mostly the left atrium and upper part of the left ventricle. And the right coronary artery is, of course, mainly supplying the right ventricle, okay? And the anterior ventricular artery is the anterior side of the left ventricle, okay? And part of the left atrium. And there's your distribution of your coronary veins. There's the areas drained by the great cardiac vein in deep blue. The light blue is the area drained by the middle cardiac vein. Of course, that's the posterior side of the heart. And then the purple is the area drained by the small cardiac vein, which is basically what you see in this kind of violet color, okay, in the right ventricle and right atrium. And on the posterior view, it's just the sides are reversed. Now you've got the middle cardiac vein serving most of the left ventricle, and then the coronary sinus between the left atrium and left ventricle. Of course, the great cardiac vein leads into the coronary sinus. Okay, and then cardiac muscle. Remember, cardiac muscle has a special disc called intercalated disc, which allow for almost instantaneous communication between the individual cardiac myocytes. But cardiac muscle is somewhat similar to skeletal muscle in that they're both striated, they both have striations. But remember, cardiac muscle is involuntary, skeletal muscle is voluntary. Okay, but they both have sliding filament mechanism. Cardiac muscle depends more on oxygen. It absolutely has to have an ample supply of oxygen because it's contraction. It's constantly contracting. It's constantly beating. Okay, it's unlike skeletal muscle, which does not have to have oxygen all the time. It sometimes operates anaerobically without oxygen, and uses some other means like for providing the energy. So you see a lot of mitochondria in cardiac muscle. Okay, but those intercalated discs are basically the special connection between cardiac muscles that allow the electrolytes to communicate, and that enables the heart to beat as a single unit. The heart is sometimes called a functional syncytium because it acts like a huge multinucleated cell. Because when it contracts as a single unit, a single automated unit. Of course, you have sarcomeres, which are basically one complete muscle fiber. Sarcolemma is of course, the cell membrane, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum basically is where the calcium is provided for the contracting muscle. Okay. You can see the transverse tubules in the sarcoplasmic reticulum in between the sarcomeres. Okay. A lot of electrolytes, ions, gap junctions, and those intercalated discs. Remember, you have I bands and A bands because of the striations. Remember, it's the T tubules and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, those triads. That's what provides the calcium to the contracting muscle. So this is a pacemaker cell action potential, which is somewhat different than a cardiac cell action potential. So in this first image, you have a slow initial depolarization phase where you have more cations leaking in than leaking out through those cardiac channels in the plasma membrane, and that causes the membrane to slowly depolarize to threshold, as you see from the figure on the right. Okay, so and that's because of those non-specific calcium channels. Okay. And then, remember, on step 2, you see the calcium channels being fully open now. Remember, in the figure 1, you have the non-specific cation channels. And then in figure 2, you have the calcium channels being opened up fully. And that causes the action potential to reach critical threshold. And that opens up all the voltage-gated calcium channels. Okay? And now calcium can now enter the cell, causing the membrane to depolarize. So you reach threshold at about negative 40 millivolts. Okay, then you get your depolarization phase. Okay, then the calcium channels then close at about plus 10 millivolts in figure 3, and the voltage-gated potassium channels then open up. Okay, and that causes the potassium to leave the cell, efflux, outflow, and the membrane then starts repolarization. That's what you see in the red area in figure 3. I'll outline it in blue here. This area right here. Okay, and then finally, you go back to the fully hyperpolarized state where you get your minimum potential phase. Okay, and that's when all the potassium channels remain open and the membrane hyperpolarizes, it becomes more negative, then it rests. There, that then opens the non-specific cation channels to open up, and their cycle then repeats itself. That's called a pacemaker cell action potential, very different from a cardiac action potential. So again, you've got your slow initial depolarization phase where more cations leak in than leak out through the non-specific cation channels in the plasma membrane, causing the membrane to slowly depolarize to threshold. And then you reach the fully depolarization phase at threshold, and that causes the calcium then to enter the cell, causing the membrane to fully depolarize. And then finally, you get your full repolarization phase where the calcium channels close and your voltage-gated potassium channels open. That causes potassium efflux and membrane repolarization. And eventually, you get your minimum potential phase where the potassium channels remain open and the membrane hyperpolarizes again, and that sets up the repeating cycle. Okay, then that opens up the non-specific cation channels, and then the cycle repeats itself. Okay, this next image basically reveals the cardiac induction cycle. Remember, the heart has to pump as a single unit, so you have to have a coordinated heartbeat. So the SA node will beat the fastest. It has the fastest discharge rate. So the SA node becomes a pacemaker. It generates an action potential that spreads to the atrial cells and the AV node. Okay, and then you get this rapid depolarization. Okay, and then at the AV node, there's a delay, about 0.1 millisecond, and then the oxygen is then conducted to the AV bundle, which is between the atria and the ventricles and the interventricular septum. And then that leads to the AV bundle, and then to the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch. And they course in the wall of the interventricular septum. Okay, and then finally the oxygen then spreads into the apex, the bottom of the heart, and spreads from the bundle branches, the right and left bundle branches, into the Purkinje fibers, which take it to the contractile cells of the ventricle. So that's how you're delivering almost instantaneously your action potential to the entire muscle of the heart, first into the atria, then into the ventricles. And so you'll always begin with a depolarization phase and then end up with a repolarization phase. So in a cardiac action potential, you have a rapid depolarization phase. Okay, and that's because the voltage-gated sodium channels are activated, and that causes sodium to enter, and you get an almost vertical swing in your action potential depolarization. Okay, and that's because of the fully open sodium gates opening up, the voltage-gated sodium channels. Notice that calcium and potassium channels are still closed. Then at the very top of this depolarization phase, the sodium channels are inactivated, and then you get some of the potassium channels opening up. And that causes potassium to slowly leak out. So when potassium leaves the cell, that causes the membrane potential to become more negative. So you get this little dip here at the very top of the depolarization phase. So that's because you get some of the potassium channels opening up, but not all of them. So you get a small initial polarization, this little dip up here that I've highlighted in yellow in this area right here. Okay. Okay, then the calcium channels now will open after the potassium channels open, and the calcium then will enter as potassium exits, and that will then prolong this depolarization phase. And that's called the plateau phase. This is represented on electrocardiogram in the area where you see the EST segment. Okay, and then eventually the sodium and calcium channels will close completely, and your potassium channels will all be completely open, and potassium continues to exit, and that will then cause a repolarization phase. That will cause your repolarization phase back to your negative potential. So rapid depolarization phase due to your voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium enters, they rapidly depolarize the membrane. You go from negative 85 to plus 20. That's an increase of plus 105 millivolts. Then you get an initial repolarization phase because potassium gates opening up, but not all of them. Some of them are still closed, but you've closed the sodium channels. Then you get your plateau phase, and that's due to the calcium channels opening up. Calcium channels are called slow channels. Okay, so you're going to get a more almost horizontal image here where your calcium slow channels are going to be slow to respond, so that gives what we'll call almost a horizontal line here, this plateau phase. And you need this plateau phase because that's going to allow the full filling of the ventricles between heartbeats. Okay, and then eventually the sodium and calcium channels will close completely, and then the rest of the potassium channels open up. That causes the potassium to exit, efflux, and that causes your repolarization phase. Remember, the atria depolarize first, and the ventricles depolarize. Okay, and then the atria repolarize, and the ventricles repolarize. In electrocardiogram, you see repolarization waves as represented as these upward and downward deflections on electrocardiogram, as we'll see later. And then, so your actions of a skeletal muscle fiber, you can see in that first figure, it's very short. It's only 1 to 3 milliseconds. Okay, and it basically deals with your sodium and potassium channels. Okay, whereas in your cardiac muscle, the actions of a cardiac contractile cell, you see this very long depolarization phase because of this plateau phase that's produced by the slow calcium channels. So you go from negative 85 to plus 20, and then you get a long extension of your depolarization phase. And what that does, that allows for the heart to function as a pump and fill up with blood to provide more force for contractions. So this is a normal electrocardiogram tracing that depicts the electrical activity of the heart during depolarization and repolarization. So if you see, look at this image here, you can see the P wave. The P wave is a result of the atrial depolarizing. Okay, as you can see that little red area. Okay, right at the very top. Let me get my marker here. Okay, there's the P wave. And it's right here. Okay, that's the P wave. Atrial depolarization. And then your QRS complex, you get one downward deflection and upward, and then another downward deflection. And that's your ventricular depolarization. Okay? And what happens is you're masking the repolarization of the atria. Normally the atria would repolarize right where you see that QRS complex, where the ventricles are depolarizing. And then following the QRS complex, you have the T wave, and that's when you have ventricular repolarization. Remember, that's when the potassium exits and the membrane goes back to its negative potential. Okay, so the entire duration of a cardiac action potential is between one R wave, the end of one R wave, and the beginning of the second R wave. Okay, so this distance between these successive R waves from here to here. Okay, that's what we call a cardiac action potential. So that's one full depolarization and repolarization of the cardiac muscle. Okay, and then your duration of atrial depolarization and the AV node delay would appear right between the beginning of the P wave and right at the beginning of the Q wave. And the entire duration of a ventricular action potential would occur between the QRS complex and the termination of the T wave. Remember, the QRS complex is your ventricular depolarization. Your T wave is your ventricular repolarization. And then your ventricular plateau phase is represented by that ST segment, the S end of the S wave and the beginning of the T wave. That's called the ST segment. Segments on an EKG do not include components of waves. Intervals do include components of waves. So that's a normal electrocardiogram depicting an ECG tracing, showing you the P wave, the QRS complex, the ST segment, the PR interval between the P wave and the R wave, the RR segment, and the QT interval. The RR interval is basically the time between heartbeats. A lot of times we use that RR interval in calculating the heart rate. Of course, the ST segment, that's recorded during the plateau phase of your action potential. P wave, that's positive deflection. That's a result of atrial depolarization. And when the atrial repolarize, it would be in the area of the QRS complex. The QRS complex, that indicates ventricular depolarization, and then the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. And the ST segment is the time period of the plateau phase of your action potential. But as your heart rate increases, the QT interval will decrease, and it will correspond to that increase in heart rate. So those are your meanings of your different electrocardiographic waves in a normal electrocardiogram. And when we look for conditions or electrical abnormalities and wave abnormalities, that can help us determine what condition the heart is in. So the EKG is a very good screening tool for cardiac disease. There's a ventricular plateau phase that's produced by the slow calcium channels in your action potential. And there's a typical electrocardiogram showing the types of arrhythmias that can occur. Sinus tachycardia means a heart rate greater than 100 beats per minute. Okay, that first illustration, the top image there is sinus tachycardia. The heart beats between 60 to 100 beats per minute. Okay, another cardiac arrhythmia is when you get delay of the conduction impulse, okay, either from disease or blocked vessels that interfere with the conduction system. But in this situation, you have a heart block at the AV node. So what you have is a P wave followed by a QRS wave, where that represents atrial depolarization and ventricular depolarization. And that's followed by a T wave, and then you get your ventricular repolarization. Then you get another P wave, but it's not followed by QRS complex. So apparently the action potential did not spread to the ventricles to get a contraction, okay, a depolarization, repolarization. And then you get another P and QRS complex. So you dropped a beat, okay. So that would be indicative of second degree AV block, okay. So you have 2 P waves for every 1 QRS complex. So that's a heart block with a 2-to-1 heart block. This third image basically shows you the P waves that are not discernible, okay, and they vary, okay. So when you see an electrocardiogram where you have these P waves that are not discernible and you're not at a predicted interval, that's what we refer to as atrial fibrillation, and that's because of the atria. Even though they're not essential for cardiac function, they can introduce blood clotting, okay, because of the regularity of the rhythm of the atrium, okay. So because you have atrial fibrillation, you're going to have an irregular heart rate, and when you don't see any discernible P waves at a predicted interval, they don't appear at regular intervals. That's called atrial fibrillation. The fourth example is what occurs in ventricular fibrillation. This one is when you have multiple pacemakers in the ventricles, that all of them tend to try to be the pacemaker. So you get this irregular rhythm that will eventually, of course, is going to cause cardiac arrest, and unless that person is shocked and given medication, that person will not survive. This is a very serious condition, and that's what occurs, of course, when somebody has a severe cardiac arrest, they have an MI or some other etiology, and they have to shock them, okay, and try to revert those waves that are being generated by the ventricles, but they're not in a coordinated fashion. You try to put all of those cardiac muscle fibers into their refractory potential. Okay, you try to throw them into refractory shock so that hopefully it'll restart the electrocardiogram, and hopefully the pacemaker, the signal, will assume control of the heartbeat. Okay, which in this case you've got multiple pacemakers causing the ventricles to have this irregular, unmonitored contraction. It's kind of like a writhing movement. Okay, we're going to stop there and then continue later. Okay, this is slide number 46, and we'll talk about the positioning of the valves during the functioning of the heart.